All right, it's good to see everybody this morning. I didn't make the transfer of notes from one to the other. We do the Wednesday night, Sunday night, but there are notes on the back table. If you did not get them, well, actually, they'd be on the little rack, probably in the middle shelf, for what's coming up next week of our study. But right now, we are finishing our look at Genesis chapter 8, or chapter 9, rather, in the life of Noah, and today we are discussing verses 8 through 17. So we're talking about the rainbow today and God's covenant for that. But before next week, if you want to grab a copy of those notes if you don't already have them. So that'll be lesson number 11 is the lesson coming up next week. Today we're finishing up lesson number 10. All right, so be turning your Bible to Genesis chapter 9. And today we get to talk about probably one of the more notable, memorable sections of the life of Noah, which is God's token of His promise, which is the rainbow. All right, so we have two questions on this, question number 5 and question number 6. We'll spend probably a little bit more time on question number 5 because we want to make some practical and cultural applications because of some things going on in our culture today. And then we'll also look at number 6 about specifically what the promise is and some of the claims of some antagonists of scriptures about why this promise can't be true. All right, so number 5 is this. What is the purpose of the rainbow? What's its purpose? And should we still look at the rainbow the same way today? And what we're really looking for here is the real deeper message behind the rainbow. Now, before we answer that, let's just read the verses, and then we'll go back through and we'll try to dissect and make some comments about what's going on. Verse 8, Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant, which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. And I think the answer probably comes to us in verse 12, again down in verse 17. There's a special word that kind of tells us what the purpose of the physical demonstration that we look at, we call the rainbow. But what is that? What's the purpose of that? It's a covenant. And especially, he uses the word here, what is it of the covenant? All right, a sign, and I think King James says token of the covenant. It is a token of the covenant, a sign of the covenant. The word that is used here is the oft used word in the Old Testament in the Hebrew language for covenant. And it can be translated in various ways. Hold your place here and go back just a few pages to Genesis chapter 1. Here's another example of the same word. And then we're going to make a point about these signs, about these tokens, and about something that was common to all of these things. So here's one example of it. Genesis 1, look at verse 14. So this is part of day 4 of creation. Then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for, and what's the next word? They are signs. And that's the same word that's used for the rainbow, that it is a sign and for seasons and for days and for years. Now, obviously, they're part of, they help with the seasonal changes upon the earth. But just looking at the idea of sign, when he's talking about celestial bodies, what do you gain from that in the idea of signs? What's the appeal here? There's signs, Art, what do you think? Okay. Okay, so there's something, the constant presence of God. There's something, behind the sign itself that tells us something about God. But what's the appeal? What's the physical appeal here? To what sense does this appeal? It's visual. And one of the things we want to develop as we go through these verses, these next two sets of verses, is every time the word sign is used, every time, it has something that has visible demonstration. It's something that people could see, and then I think, Art, you're exactly right, that behind the visible sign itself was this deep understanding of something about God going on. But it's visual. Look at Genesis 4. Genesis chapter 4. And, we're doing the life of Noah, the study of Noah. So obviously it's not a study of Genesis. So we never got a chance to go back and study the early chapters, which could be a whole nother study in and of itself, creation and everything that follows that. Look at verse 15. You know the story, so we don't have to, recap the entire story. But Cain is obviously sent away because of what he did to his brother Abel. Watch verse 15. The Lord said, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold, and the Lord will set" what? A mark. It's the same word. It's the same word that means sign. It's the same word that means here mark, lest anyone finding him should kill him. What's the appeal? What's the sense that would detect this? It's visual, right? So there are signs in the celestial bodies. The celestial bodies are signs to us in the sense that we can see them. They do something visually for us. And now, I don't know what it is, but somehow there was a mark, visible mark, put upon Cain that would indicate this connection to God's promise and his vengeance in verse 15. But there's something very visible about the signs that God gives. And so, already we know that when God says he's putting the rainbow in the sky, that's meant to appeal to us visually so that we can get, like Art was saying, the deeper message that stands behind it. Now, just a few more. Look at Exodus chapter 3. I just want to offer a few more of these, just to show that we're consistent in making this point about signs. Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. This is Moses' encounter with God back on the backside of the desert. There's the burning bush that's not consumed, and he's curious about that. Goes, finds God's presence there, and so this conversation starts taking place. And there's now going to be a confirmation of this promise when he says, verse 12, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be the sign. That's the same word back in chapter 9 of Genesis. The sign shall be to you that I've sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. And so he says, when you get back to this mountain, it will be a sign, visible, discernible sign, that my promise to you is true. Stay in the same book. Look at chapter 31, Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31. And drop down with me to verse 12 and 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, because, or for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Now, it's not like it's an object, but it is a day set aside for a special purpose under the law of Moses, but it's also not just visual, it's discernible, right? There's some reminder that's set behind that. And we don't have to look at the rest of these, but Deuteronomy 6, verses 8 and 22, the same thing. Interestingly, Isaiah 7, verse 11, they were asking for a sign, and in verse 14 he says, This is the sign that will be given to you. Behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a son, his name will be called Emmanuel, speaking of Jesus. But the visible sign would be the virgin conception of Jesus Christ. So when God talks about signs, they were always visible. There was something discernible about them. You knew that when you saw this, when we would see this, if we lived back then, this was an indication of what it served to remind us of. So there was always a message behind it. So the rainbow is the physical part that draws our attention. But what is it a physical attention grabber to remind us of? And I think, Terry, you said it earlier. What's it supposed to remind us of? The covenant. That's what it's there to remind us of. It's not just arbitrary. God didn't say, hey, I'm going to put this beautiful rainbow in the sky and it's going to be pleasant to look at, which it is. They're beautiful. But there's supposed to be the deeper, and there is the deeper message that stands behind it. And so it is a sign or a token of the covenant. And interestingly, in verse 12 and in verse 17, God says, I've given this to you. I've said it here. I hate that critics have done this. Art, go ahead.
One thing that also impresses me is that sign is available to everybody all over the world. I don't care what you believe.
Absolutely.
What you think,
That's right.
it's still there.
Yeah. That truth is for everybody. Because in this passage, God said, it is to how many living creatures? Everybody. So it'd be on the other side of the world. There's rainbows over there too, because even though they may be distant from God or have put God off or they don't know Him yet, He's still making clear that this is a covenant for every generation that will ever live upon the earth, to everybody that lives during that generation and every living thing during that generation. This covenant is for them. So very, very good point. There are some, I hate that they've done this, there are some critics who say this was nothing new, that Noah and his family had seen rainbows before, and that this was a feature that had been present, because when God says that I'm setting this in the clouds to see, that I've established this between you and me, like in verse 17 they're saying, that language is suggested that the rainbows had always been around. Do you think there were rainbows before the flood? I don't believe it for a second. Not only is the Bible telling us that He's drawing Noah's attention and Noah's family, right? His wife and his sons and their wives are there, and God's drawing attention to this newfound thing, something they've never seen before. But could the conditions before the flood have produced this? No, it could not have been produced before the flood. Because remember, what was above the atmosphere of the earth? A water vapor canopy, right? There was water above it. According to Genesis chapter 1, the firmament was water on both sides. And in chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, we learned that was there. And we talked about how the sunlight would have been very different coming down through that. It would have been filtered greatly through that. And then it had never done what before? It had never rained before. So the conditions were not right. So the conditions now have opened themselves just perfectly for God to allow this to happen. And the hydrologic cycles that we have now allow for rainbows. So there had never been a rainbow before. God says it's between me and you, right? So God binds Himself to this covenant. And I think this is interesting. I don't know who said this a long time ago, but there's two things of proof here. There's proof when it comes to the flood. And I've heard people say the rainbow is the proof of the flood. Well, maybe indirectly that's true. But the real proof of the flood, the physical proof of the flood, is the fossil record. What's the proof of God's faithfulness? The rainbow is the proof of His faithfulness. So you have the fossil record that's the proof of the flood, because the evidence is there. It's buried all over the world. But the proof of God's faithfulness is in the rainbow. And the rainbow is all about the faithfulness of God. That's what it's all about. Because if you think now, having been removed for a couple of thousand years since that rainbow to us, every time you get out on a post-rainy day and the sun's poking through and there's this arching rainbow that goes from seemingly horizon to horizon for us, it's a reminder that God's promise still stands true, that God is a faithful God. Yes, go ahead, Beth.
In addition to God's promise reigning true forever, it's also never changing. The rainbow is always in the same order.
Isn't it interesting? I love that. I love the hues of it and the way they always appear in the same exact order. It's just, again, an emphasis on the orderliness of God and how He arranges things. Beautiful. There are a couple of times when the rainbow is mentioned in the Bible beyond this. And when it is, there's always something about the majesty of God that our attention is drawn to in this. So let's turn to a couple of these. One is in the Old Testament. One is in Ezekiel, the first chapter. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel, the first chapter. Ezekiel, the first chapter. And go down with me to verse 28 of Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, one thing about Ezekiel is he has all these visions of the throne of God. He sees the throne of God, and it's always in some relation. It's above him, below him, beside him, and through Ezekiel. And he's always seeing something about the majesty of God. Well, look at verse 28. Speaking of God and his appearance, like the appearance of a rainbow on a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So the rainbow is always connected to how majestic, how august God is in Scripture. The remaining two references come to us in Revelation. So look at Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4. So this is when John gets sort of vaulted into the throne room of God. You know, he sees the crystal sea, and all the creatures are bowing before the throne of God. So he's providing this symbolic description of how majestic God's presence is. So verse 2, immediately as I was in the Spirit, behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and sardis stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. Well, that's meant to because rainbows are beautiful, and so it's meant to draw our attention to how awe-inspiring and how majestic God is. And the other reference comes in chapter 10. Comes in chapter 10. And look at verse 1. I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. So the rainbow is not something that God established, and he just forgot about it, and it was sort of this incidental thing, and it never really meant a whole lot to him. It has deep meaning, and God always uses that to connect to how majestic he is, ultimately to remind us of how faithful he is. I jotted down a bunch of scriptures about the faithfulness of God. I don't want to look at them all, but since we're in the New Testament, let's just catch maybe one or two of these, and then I'll just make passing reference to one in the Old Testament. Since we're close, look at Hebrews chapter 10. I'll just try to walk these back. Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. Look at verse 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Why? Because the one that promised it is what? He's faithful. That's why we have such confidence, because God is faithful. Does he ever fail his promises? Not ever. He never fails his promises. God is faithful. How about 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. I'm trying to walk them back in order here so we can walk back. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Look at verse 3. 2 Thessalonians 3:3. But the Lord is what? He is faithful. I love that. Who will establish you and guard you from the evil one, and he will do that. I jotted down a bunch of these. The only other one I want to look at is, go back with me to, let's do Deuteronomy chapter 7. They're all great verses, and I'm not trying to take anything away from the other verses. Just go back to Deuteronomy 7 on our way back to Genesis. Deuteronomy chapter 7. I just like the language of this one. Deuteronomy chapter 7. And the one thing I love about this one is in its context. He's warning them about when they go over, early in the chapter, when they go over into the land of Canaan, don't make marriages with the Canaanite people. They're going to turn your heart away from the Lord. What he's telling them now is essentially, if you trust me, I will always have your back. I've always got your back if you will trust me. That's what verse 9 is about. So he goes, therefore know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations to those who love him and keep his commandments. Now, when he says 1,000 generations, does he mean at the 1,001st generation he won't be faithful anymore? No. This is just it's one of those use of numbers in sort of a figurative way to mean indefinitely. He will always be faithful. But that is what the rainbow represents, the faithfulness of God. God is saying, trust me, know that I'm faithful, and the rainbow will be a constant reminder of this promise that I'm giving you my word. I'll never flood the world again like it happened before. I'll never do that. In fact, in verse 16, go back to Genesis chapter 9, look at verse 16. What does he call the covenant? What kind? Everlasting, which means what? For as long as this earth stands, that covenant will never be done away with. And every time we see the rainbow, every time we see it, it is a reminder of the faithfulness of God. All right, let's pause for a second. Should we see the rainbow exactly the same way today? Should. Do people today sometimes see the rainbow for a different purpose? What's it being used for today? Representative of the LGBTQ movement, which is, it's what is just and I say this not because I'm calling people insane. I'm saying the idea of it is just insanity, because the rainbow happened because God destroyed the world because of what? Because of sin. And now it's being used as a representation of sin. I did not know until I was doing some research on this that it's been around for longer than I thought that it was. The rainbow flag has been around since 1978. These names probably won't mean anything to you. One may. There was a guy by the name of Gilbert Baker who was an artist. He was a Vietnam War veteran of the Vietnam War, and he had gotten into art. He was commissioned to do a number of things. A lot of them were military-style artworks, but he got commissioned because of his connection to the gay community to do a gay flag, and he was commissioned by a guy whose name was Harvey Milk. Have you ever heard of Harvey Milk? There was a movie out sometime about milk, and it was about Harvey Milk. He was a gay politician in San Francisco, and he's the one who commissioned Gilbert Baker to make the rainbow flag. Now, prior to that, there was a lot of irony in this. There's a lot of contradiction in this. Before that, they just used a pink triangle, which is, the crazy thing was, that was the symbol the Nazis had given to homosexuals. That's how they marked homosexuals. And now, in some classrooms, like in California and other places, gay teachers are putting pink triangles in their room to identify themselves as gay, when that was the symbol of Nazi Germany. You see the craziness of it all. But the gay flag has become the most popular symbol of the LGBTQ movement. And I just think it's so... It's just crazy that they would take something that's a reminder of the faithfulness of God in destroying the world over sin, and now use that very same thing to try to represent a sinful thing. Any thoughts on that? But that's obviously, and that has obviously distorted a lot of people's view today of what the rainbow actually means, because people see that and they think it's the rainbow flag. And I know people who won't even. We had somebody once say, well, I think Eve Rose or somebody had like a rainbow, and they're like, you better be careful. People think that's a gay flag. And I was like, the gays don't own the rainbow. They don't own it. It belongs to the Lord. It's His rainbow. And I think I can celebrate what that means in the right way, because it doesn't belong. A group of people in sin don't get to take something that's right and wholesome and good and majestic and turn that into something that's bad. They just don't get to do that. In the rainbow, though, there is a reminder that God is patient but not tolerant. He doesn't tolerate, because the rainbow is certainly a reminder of that. And I think Galatians 5 and 1 Corinthians 6 remind us that there are certain activities that God does not like. And while we try to help those folks, God's not tolerant of that. And the rainbow is certainly a reminder of that. Any thoughts on that? I just thought it was important to throw that in, because we do see that. What's that? Yeah, it's the attempt to rewrite history. It's the attempt to do that, to take everything that's been good or defining of normal civilization and turn it into something different. I think it's that. Okay, number six question. Exactly what is the promise? Okay, some contend that the existence of local flooding makes God a liar, and is that true, and why? What is the entire promise. What's the specific promise here behind the rainbow? The earth again. Okay, and he says that several times. Look at verse 8 and 9 again. I think this is interesting. So God speaks to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Behold, as for me, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Now, I love the way in the original this is worded. It would be tough to translate literally because it just doesn't flow like we would normally speak. But the idea would be something like this. Behold, even I, and it's doing that. Remember that language feature we talked about where things can be repeated for the sake of emphasis? And that's one of these to draw our attention to the fact that God this is His covenant. He's binding Himself to this, and it's His. So God's doing this. This is not something where it's conditioned upon our obligation that I'll do this if this. This is simply saying this is set in stone. It's an unconditional promise. It's never going to be changed. It's never going to be altered. And He makes a covenant, which is a promise with all the earth, and is an everlasting covenant, so it will always be that way according to verse 18 and following. And even in verse 8 and following, we learn that it's unconditional, not based on our response. So the promise is specifically this. Look at verse 11. Gene just said this. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Our reference, our context to that is what just happened. If there was any contention, we can just simply say God is saying that He will never do what He just did. And what did He just do? Destroyed the world, covered it with water. That's the promise. Look at verse 15. I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Okay? That's the promise. But there has been contention, and I've heard a Christian argue this way, that the rainbow can't be an indication that God will never flood the world again because there's been severe flooding in many places. And there has been severe flooding in places. And, you see typhoons come through and wipe out certain places because it floods the island, or villages get flooded. And you had Katrina. I heard some folks say after Katrina that that's not what the rainbow means because He flooded this. As bad as that was, and it was horrible, and it could still happen yet. There'd be flooding everywhere, and in these low places you could have certain towns. I think recently up near somewhere in Kentucky, wasn't it? Maine. So, and just low areas it happens. But does that mean that the promise of God is not true? No. It's terrible when it happens. But God has only ever promised to not flood the world with the water so that the water covered the highest peaks of the mountains by 15 cubits. He's not going to do that again. But there's nothing against this promise by local flooding. So the promise relates to universal worldwide destruction and not local flooding. And interestingly, some of the lowest areas that get the flooding, why do you think those areas are ultimately so low topographically? Probably because of the flood, because some of those areas ended up getting pushed down as the earth was claving together. So it does nothing to do that against the promise of God. He's only ever promised not to flood the entire world. And that's what we ought to see when we see the rainbow, that even though and it usually comes on when you've had rain, you've had sometimes heavy rain, and there can be pools of water in the yard, or sometimes creeks rise, and sometimes roads get covered by water, and yet you see this rainbow, which is a promise and a reminder of the promise, hey, I'm not flooding the world ever again. There might be some local flooding, but I'll never flood the world again. Any thoughts on the rainbow? Any thoughts on this section? Beautiful section. All right. Let's put a peg in it here. We're just short of the first bell, so let's hang out here. We still have some classes probably waiting on the first bell or two. But go ahead, if you haven't grabbed a copy, grab a copy of lesson number 11. And that deals with the end part of Genesis chapter 9. This is post-flood, and now in the text it says Noah gets drunk and he passes out in his tent. And now something happens with one of his sons, and one of the grandsons gets cursed, and it seems like what's going on? So we're going to try to figure all that out in the next week or so. And then we'll be rounding out our discussion pretty soon, which means we need a new topic our new part of the Bible for study, because we always try to do textual on Sunday mornings. So do you have a recommendation? A book in the New Testament? Maybe a section of the Old Testament? If you have any ideas, let me know, and we'll try to work that out. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Lesson 11 is probably in that shelf up there. It's probably there.